The maid's voice was shaking. "She is at the door, my lady." Lady Storrington did not look up from the lace pillow in her lap. She finished the stitch she had begun. Then, she set the pillow aside and said very quietly, "Let her come." A moment later, her oldest friend walked into the hall of Cadenham Hall, wearing diamonds at her throat and the brightest smile in the county. An hour earlier, 40 guests had watched the master of that house stand up at his own table and cast his wife out in front of every tenant, every neighbor, every servant he owned. Some of the ladies were still weeping. One old earl had called it the cruelest thing he had seen in 50 years. Now the woman who had waited years for that moment stood between Lady Storrington and the door. "I have everything now," she said. Everyone in that hall expected tears. They expected a slap. They expected a broken woman on her knees begging for one more chance, because that is exactly what they had watched her do an hour before. Instead, the woman who had just lost her home, her name and her child, took her friend's hands and smiled and said 6 words. "Take good care of him, Augusta." Her friend laughed. She thought it was defeat. She thought it was a proud woman losing gracefully. She would remember those 6 words on the coldest night of her life, and by then, she would understand exactly what she had been handed. Before I tell you why, a woman who had just been disgraced in front of 40 people walked out of that house lighter than she had felt in 6 years. Please support our channel. Like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Your support keeps these stories coming to you every week. Now let us go back to the autumn of 1836, when all of England agreed that Sir Gervase Storrington was the finest husband in the county. The Wrenbury Ball opened the hunting season, and in the autumn of 1836, the whole of that corner of Wiltshire came to it. Candles burned in every sconce along the gallery, and by 10 o'clock the floor was full. Men who held 400 acres stood in the same room as men who held 4,000, and everybody watched everybody. At 10:30, the announcement came. Sir Gervase Storrington, Lady Storrington. The talk did not stop. It only thinned the way a river thins over stone, and then it turned toward the doors. High came in first. He was 35 that year, dark, straight in the back, in a coat cut so plainly that it made every other coat in the room look as though it were trying too hard. Verity came in on his arm in ivory silk, with a string of amethysts at her throat and a band of lace at each wrist that she had made herself. 4 young women asked him to dance that evening. He refused all 4, and he did it beautifully. He bowed. He said he was honored. He said the same sentence each time, loud enough for the nearest 6 people to hear it. "Every dance in this house belongs to my wife." By midnight, the sentence had traveled the whole gallery. Near the refreshment table, 2 countesses watched him lead Verity out for the second waltz. "If mine looked at me like that," said the first, "I should never complain of anything again." She came out of a Devon parsonage with nothing, said the second, and now look at her. Verity heard it. She had learned to hear things while smiling at somebody else. Between the second and third dances, Lady Wrenbury caught her sleeve. She was an old woman with a hard eye for workmanship and no patience for compliments she did not mean. "Stand still, child. Who made that lace?" "I did, my lady." The old woman turned the wrist over toward the candles and looked at it for a long moment. "Honiton work," she said. "Proper Honiton. Nobody under 60 makes that anymore. Remember that I said so." Verity laughed and said something modest and moved on, and had forgotten it before the end of the week. Lady Wrenbury did not forget it. 4 years later, she would be the reason a certain newspaper reached a certain workroom in London. At 1 o'clock, Lionel Storrington found Verity by the window. Lionel was her husband's cousin, 5 years younger, a quiet man who lived in Bath and was never quite invited anywhere. He said the weather had turned. He said the funds had come down again, and a man would be a fool to hold consuls this year. Then he laughed at himself for talking business to a lady at a ball, and bowed and went away. Verity said perhaps 11 words in the whole exchange. Across the gallery, her husband watched every one of them. They left at 2. In the courtyard, Gervase handed her up into the carriage himself, then took a wool blanket from the seat and put it round her shoulders and tucked it at her knees, while the Wrenbury stablemen held the horses and watched, and the older of them said afterwards that he had never seen a gentleman so careful of a wife. Inside, the carriage smelled of wet leather. Verity sat with her hands in her lap and counted the milestones. There were 9 between Wrenbury House and their own gates. She had counted them so often that she knew where each one fell in the dark by the sound the wheels made on the turn. Gervais said nothing for all 9. At the 9th, she began to breathe carefully, in through the nose and out slowly, the way she did before a thing she could not stop. The great oak doors of Cadenham Hall closed behind them with a sound like a book shutting. Mrs. Beale took the cloaks. The footman went. Within a minute, the hall was empty except for the 2 of them and 1 branch of candles. Then he took hold of the amethysts and pulled. The clasp gave. Stones went across the marble and under the side table and down between the boards. Verity did not move. She had learned that moving made it longer. "What did he say to you?" Gervais said. She looked up. "Sir Gervais, I do not think Lionel, at the window. What did he say to you?" "He said the weathers had turned, and that the funds had fallen." "Say it again." She said it again. He struck her across the face, and she went down on one knee among the loose amethysts. "Say it again." She said it again, and there was blood in her mouth now, and it made the words thick. He made her say it 11 times. I was not shouting. That was the thing she could never afterwards explain to anybody. He stood quite still with his hands behind his back, listening the way a man listens to a clerk reading out a column of figures to see whether it comes to the same total twice. That was the night Verity understood something that 4 years of marriage had not taught her. I was not angry with her. He was checking something. There was an account somewhere that she had never seen, and she was written into it. And tonight he had wanted to know how much Lionel Storrington knew about it. When he had finished, he went to the door and stopped without turning round. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "the county will see a happy wife again." "Yes, Sir Gervais." Out in the corridor, Mrs. Beale drew the door quietly shut. She had been housekeeper at Cadenham for 27 years, and she had heard that particular sound before. Verity rinsed her mouth at the ewer and went up to the nursery. Clemency was 3. She slept the way small children sleep, flat on her back, with both arms thrown out entirely, certain that the world was a safe place. Verity stood over her a while without touching her because a woken child asks questions. Then she went to her own room and sat down on the edge of the bed and put one hand flat against her stomach. She was 4 months gone and nobody knew. She had told nobody. Not her husband, not her mother, not the physician. Only Mrs. Marrow, who had been sewing for the family since before Verity was born, and who had guessed it in September from the way Verity had stopped taking sugar in her tea. She did not light this candle. She took the lace pillow from beside the bed and worked in the dark because after 18 years of it, the hands know where the pins are and the eyes are only in the way. 4 and cross. 4 and cross. Counting was the only thing that stopped her hands shaking. And while she counted, she made herself think the cold thought all the way through, because thinking it in daylight was impossible. If the child was a boy, the child was a shield. A boy would be the heir. A man does not damage the woman who is carrying his heir, and afterwards, he does not damage the mother of it, not badly, not where it shows. If the child was a girl, then in 3 years there would simply be a second Clemency in this house, sleeping with both arms thrown out entirely, certain that the world was a safe place. She worked until the sky over the park went gray. Then she put the pillow away and powdered the mark on her cheek and went down to breakfast, and the county saw a happy wife again. I went up to London at the beginning of November and came back on the 4th day in a mood she recognized before he was out of the carriage. In the library, he threw a bundle of papers down the length of the table at her. "Burn those," he said, and went out. Verity took them to the fire and knelt down, and then because he had not stayed to watch, she read them first. They were a solicitor's opinion, 9 pages of it in a hand, so clear that a woman who had never been taught a word of law could follow the shape of it if she read it twice. Cadenham was not his. That was the whole of it dressed up in 400 words. He held it for his life only. The land was settled on his eldest son, and his eldest son did not exist. And until that son existed and came of age, there was nobody living who could join with him to cut the settlement loose. He could sell nothing but his own life interest, which would fetch very little, and which every man in the county would hear about within a fortnight. The last page said in the flat way that solicitors say ruinous things, that Sir Gervais's difficulties could not be relieved from the land, and that he must look to other sources. Verity read that sentence twice, and then put all 11 pages into the fire and watched them go. Other sources. She did not know what that meant. She would not know for another 14 months. But she knelt there in front of the grate a good while after the last page had curled, and something in her had shifted an inch and would never shift back. 2 nights later, the soup came to the table cold. The cook had been taken ill at 4 o'clock, and the whole kitchen had been running behind ever since. It was a matter of 6 or 7 minutes. The dish was warm. The soup was not. Gervais took 1 spoonful and set the spoon down. Nobody at the table moved. Verity reached for the tureen and said quite calmly, "I will have it taken back at once." She did not finish the sentence. He picked up the heavy silver serving dish with 1 hand and threw it, and it caught her low across the body, and she went down between her chair and the wall, with the dish clattering after her. 2 footmen came forward. He looked at them, and they stopped where they were. It was one of the housemaids who screamed half a minute later when the stain began to spread through the gray silk. They sent for Mr. Craddock at 9. He was there by 10 and did not leave until sunrise, and the rest of the household stood about in the passages, saying nothing. Just after 6 he came out. He was a surgeon and not a delicate man, and had been 40 years at it, and his face said the whole thing before he opened his mouth. Verity was awake. She had refused the laudanum because she wanted to hear whatever was going to be said, and she heard it through the door, which stood a hand's width open. "I am very sorry, Sir Gervais." There was a pause. Then Gervais asked 1 question. "What was it?" Craddock did not seem to understand him at first. "The child," Sir Gervais said. "What was it?" "A boy, sir." Nobody spoke for a moment. Verity, lying still with her face toward the door, heard her husband cross the passage to the chimney-piece, and heard the small sound a man's fingernail makes on the glass of a clock when he tips it toward the light. Then she heard him say, half to himself in an ordinary voice, as though he were working out how long a journey would take, 3 years and 4 months. Then he went downstairs and called for his horse. He did not come into the room that night nor the next day. Verity lay still and put out her hand toward the table by the bed, where Mrs. Marrow had put the small square of embroidered flannel she had been working on since August, and she took it and held it against her chest with both hands, and she did not cry. She had cried the first year. She understood by now that it did nothing. What she did instead was lie there and turn 1 sentence over and over the way you turn a stone in your pocket. 3 years and 4 months from what? 3 days later, before she was strong enough for it, she took the mail as far as Honiton in a carrier's cart the last 10 miles, and she went home. The parsonage at Branscombe smelled of peat smoke and damp hymn books, exactly as it had smelled her whole childhood. Her mother opened the door and the color went out of her face. Verity got as far as the kitchen table and then came apart entirely in a way she had not allowed herself at Cadenham, and Charlotte Dunstan held her and rocked her and said, my girl, what has been done to you?" Her father came in from the study. Edmund was home from Oxford for the long vacation. Sophia, who was 15, stood in the doorway with a dishcloth in her hands and did not come any further in. Verity rolled back both sleeves. There were finger marks above both elbows. There was a burn on the inside of the left wrist that was 3 weeks old and had not been dressed. There was a bruise across the whole of the right forearm in the shape of something with an edge. And then, because she had come 4 days to say it, she said it. "He killed my son." The kitchen was very quiet. The kettle went on ticking on the hob. Her mother put both hands over her mouth and began to cry. And her father, the Reverend Josiah Dunstan, who had baptized her and married her, and had preached at her wedding on the text of the 2 becoming 1 flesh, said the first thing that came into his head. "Did anybody see you come here?" Verity looked at him. She said, "I have come because I need help." He looked at the floor a moment and then began, in the voice he used from the pulpit, on the duty of a wife and on the patience of Sarah. Her mother took both her hands across the table. Charlotte Dunstan was 50 in that year and looked 60, and she was crying so hard she could barely get it out. "Bear it a little longer, my child, only a little longer." Verity turned to her brother. Edmund was 24. Cadenham money had paid for Oxford, was paying for it still, and would pay for the living that had already been half promised him. He had heard every word from the stairs. He came the whole way down, and he knelt on the flagstones in front of his sister's chair, which was worse than anything else that happened in that room, and he took her hand. 2 years, he said. Only until I am ordained. Verity, I have no other means in the world. 2 years. Sophia opened her mouth. Her father lifted one finger without even looking round, and Sophia shut it again. Verity said nothing at all for a long moment. Then she asked her father a question that she had thought of on the mail coach and had not meant to ask. Papa, she said, may I see the settlement? He said it was not a woman's business. She said it is my marriage. He said the papers were in Exeter with the attorney, and there was nothing in them she would understand. Verity waited until after supper, when her father had gone across to the church to lock up, and then she went into the study and opened the second drawer of the writing table, which was where he had kept everything of importance since she was 6 years old, and it was not in Exeter at all. It was in a japanned tin box under the parish registers tied in pink tape, dated the 11th day of July, 1832. She took it to the window and read it by what was left of the light. She had signed it herself at 22 without reading a word, because her father had put his finger on the line and said, "Sign their child." The first part she understood at once, because it was in plain figures. £300 a year to the Reverend Josiah Dunstan, payable half-yearly out of the Cadenham rents for the term of his natural life. 300 a year, more than 4 times the living was worth. The second part took her longer, because it was written in the other language, the long one with no full stops in it. She read it 4 times before she was certain she had it. There was to be no settlement to her separate use, no trustees, no jointure secured on the land, no pin money that anybody could be made to pay. Every provision of that kind had been struck out of the draft, and the striking out had been agreed to and initialed, and one of the sets of initials was J.D. Her father had been offered a jointure for his daughter and had traded it away for an annuity for himself, which meant that since the 11th day of July, 1832, there had never been a single shilling in the world that belonged to Verity Storrington. Not the amethysts, not the lace at her own wrists. Under the law of England, a married woman owned nothing whatever, and the one door through which a careful father might have passed something to her had been shut by her careful father for £300 a year before the ink on the marriage lines was dry. She stood at the window with the papers in her hand until it was too dark to see them. Then she tied the pink tape again and put the box back under the registers and closed the drawer, because she had understood in the last 10 minutes that there was no longer the slightest use in making a scene. Her father came back from the church. Verity said, "Papa, what was I worth a year?" He did not answer her. He never did answer her then or afterwards, not in 1836 and not in 1840, and that silence turned out to be the truest thing he ever said to her. She went back to Cadenham the next day. The carriage came up the avenue at dusk. She had powdered her face on the road, but her eyes had been swollen for 2 days, and there was nothing to be done about that. Gervase was in the drawing-room with the newspaper. He looked up at her over it, and he looked at her eyes, and something in his own face settled comfortably, like a man lowering himself into a chair that fits him. "Your family have reminded you where you belong," he said. "Yes, sir, Gervase." She went upstairs and looked in on Clemency, who was awake, and who held up both arms. And that night, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark with the lace pillow in her lap, Verity found that the question in her head had changed. For 4 years, the question had been, "Where can I go?" It was not that anymore. She had gone as far as there was to go, and the door at the far end had been shut in her face by her own father with his own initials on the paper. The question now was a different one, and it was the beginning of everything that came after. Who wrote this law, she thought? And is there a gap anywhere in it? Augusta Pelham began coming to Cadenham in the January of 1837. She came in her father's gig, and she never came empty-handed. Hothouse flowers in January, which must have cost Marlcombe more than Marlcombe could afford. Almond cakes from a shop in Bath. A green tea that she swore was better than anything in the county, and that Verity privately thought tasted of hay. Novels in 3 volumes, always the second volume first, because Augusta had a genius for losing things. They had been at the same school in Bath for 2 years, a long time ago, when Verity was a parson's daughter on a reduced fee, and Augusta was the only girl there who had not cared about that. "I cannot bear to think of you rattling about in this great cold house on your own," Augusta said the first afternoon. She said it kindly. She meant it kindly. That was the part nobody understood afterwards. They sat where the fire drew properly, and they worked and read to one another. And when the weather lifted, they walked to the end of the beach avenue and back. Augusta talked, and Verity, who had learned in 4 years of marriage to say as little as possible, found that she was talking too. Those afternoons were the best hours of Verity's week, and she would not afterwards pretend otherwise. Not even when she knew everything. There was one thing she did not notice, though the servants noticed it within a month. When Augusta said Sir Gervais, her voice came down half a tone. Verity heard only that somebody in the house had a good opinion of him and was foolishly grateful for it. While Augusta came in the afternoons, Verity spent her mornings differently. She began with the accounts. She went to the steward, Mr. Ockley, and said that the household books were a disgrace and that she meant to take them in hand and bring the year down by £50. Ockley was delighted. Nobody had taken an interest in his ledgers in 11 years, and he gave her 3 mornings a week for the whole of that winter. He taught her the double entry and how a tradesman's bill is built and where the padding hides in it, and that you never argue with a bill, you only ask the man to send it again with the dates set out. "A bill with a date on it," Ockley said, "is a witness that never forgets and never contradicts itself." That was the sentence that stayed with her, though she could not have said why. The second thing was the lace. Mrs. Merrow was 55 that year and had been sewing for the family since Gervais was a boy. She came from Beer, 4 miles along the coast from the parsonage where Verity had grown up, and she had learned the work at 6 years old, the way every girl in that village learned it, sitting on a stool in a doorway to catch the light. Verity already knew the plain grounds. Her mother had taught her those before she could read. What Mrs. Merrow taught her that winter was the other thing. The fine sprigs, the raised work, the rose ground that takes 4 days to make a piece the size of a playing card. The work that had gone into court dresses when Mrs. Merrow was young, and that in 1837 perhaps 200 women in England could do it all. "Why does her ladyship want this?" Mrs. Merrow asked once. "Because I like to be able to do a thing well," Verity said, and Mrs. Merrow looked at her over the pillow and went back to the pricking, and did not ask again. The third thing was the newspapers. Gervais took 2, and when he had done with them, they went down to the servants' hall and then to the kitchen fire. Verity began intercepting them on the way. She did not read the politics. She read the law reports at the back, the column of small print that nobody reads, the one that carries the chancery causes, and the ecclesiastical suits and the assize calendars. She did not understand 1 word in 5 at first. By the summer, she understood most of it, and she had learned 3 words that had not existed for her in January: separation, settlement, trustee. The king died on the 20th of June. The bell went in the village, and the servants put on their black, and Gervais ordered the shutters half closed, and the county settled down to a general mourning that everybody privately found rather enjoyable. The new queen was 18 years old. Verity stood at the window with her hand on the shutter and looked down the beach avenue and thought a thought she did not say to anybody at all. They have given a girl of 18 the whole of England, and I am 27, and there is not a gown in my wardrobe that the law says is mine. On the 1st of July, the registration began. Verity went down to the village on some errand about blankets and found the schoolroom being used for something else entirely. There was a trestle table in it, and a man of about 30 behind the table with 3 new books in front of him, bound in dark leather and stamped, and every leaf inside them blank. His name was Cuthbert Snell, and he had been made registrar for the district a fortnight before, and he had the particular pride of a small official who has just been handed a great machine to work. I explained it at some length because there was nobody else in the room, and he had been waiting 3 weeks for somebody to ask. Every marriage, my lady, every birth, every death. Not the parish book anymore, or not that only. The state's book, written twice, and 1 copy goes up to London 4 times a year and lies in the General Register Office forever. And who may look at it, Verity said. She meant it only as politeness. Anybody, said Snell. Anybody at all on paying the fee. and the copy I give them is signed and sealed by me, and it stands as evidence in any court in England without a living soul to swear to it." Verity said she was sure it was a great improvement and bought her blankets and went home. She thought no more about it for 2 years and 4 months. The garden at Cadenham ran 200 yards down from the west front to a fountain that had not worked since the old baronet's time, and past the fountain to an oak that was older than the house. On a warm night in the September of 1837, Verity could not sleep and got up and saw a lantern moving down there among the statues. She put a shawl over her nightgown and went down the back stairs and out through the flower room and followed the gravel because the grass was wet. She heard the laughing before she saw them, and that was what stopped her, because Gervais did not laugh. Not in that house. She had heard him laugh perhaps 6 times in 5 years, and never once indoors. She stopped behind the second oak and stood still. I was holding both of Augusta's hands. The same hands. That was all Verity could think of for the first few seconds. The same 2 hands. "I almost pity her," Augusta was saying. "You pity my wife?" "I do. She is not what she was." "She stopped being that a long while ago," Gervais said, and looked back up the lawn at the house. Then Augusta asked the question she had plainly been rehearsing for weeks, in the light, careless voice of a woman who has rehearsed something for weeks. "If you were free, would you choose me?" "I shall not have any reason to keep her much longer," he said. Augusta made a small sound, and then she said, "Then I should be Lady Storrington." Verity waited to feel it. She was braced for it the way you brace for a wave. She had been braced for something like this for 2 years, and had told herself she would take it standing up. It did not come. What came instead up through her chest so fast that she had to put a hand over her own mouth was relief. Somebody wanted it. Somebody wanted the necklace and the ivory silk and the name, and the man wanted it badly enough to stand in a wet garden at midnight asking for it. Verity had spent 2 years unable to imagine any door out of Cadenham except one, and she had thought about that one door more often than she liked to remember on the bad nights, standing at the top of the marble stairs. And here was another door, and it had opened by itself, and somebody else was pushing at it from the far side. She was smiling behind her own hand in the dark. She could feel that she was. Then Augusta said the sensible thing. "But you cannot divorce her." And Gervais said quite easily, "No. I do not intend to trouble Parliament." Verity stopped smiling. "There are quieter ways than the courts," he said. "There is a house at Chiswick. Very well conducted. Gardens." He said something else that she could not hear, and then he said, and this she heard perfectly, because he laughed as he said it, 2 signatures. That is the whole of it. 2 signatures and a fee. Augusta laughed too, because she did not know what he meant. Verity was almost certain of that afterwards. Augusta did not know, but Verity knew. She had been reading the law reports at the back of her husband's newspapers for 8 months, and twice in those 8 months, she had read the same kind of small paragraph. A gentleman, a wife. 2 medical certificates under the Act, signed by 2 men who need never have met her before that morning. A private licensed house in a pleasant suburb with a wall round the garden. And after that, nothing. No appeal that a woman shut inside such a place could make, because a woman certified insane cannot instruct an attorney, cannot swear an affidavit, cannot be believed by anybody about anything, including about being sane. And the children stay with the father. Always, in every case, without argument, because there is no argument to be had. Verity stood behind the oak with the wet grass soaking through her slippers. I was not going to let her go. He was going to bury her alive 7 miles from London and keep clemency and marry Augusta over the top of her, and she would be in that house for 40 years, sane and screaming it, which is the one thing that proves you are not. She went back up the gravel with her nails driven into her palms to keep her feet moving at a walk. In her own room, she lit the candle and got out the leather book she had kept since her wedding day. The early pages were buckled where they had been cried on. There were prayers in it in her own hand that made her feel ill to look at now. She turned to a clean page and dipped the pen and wrote 1 line, and then she sat looking at it until the candle was down an inch. This day I stopped praying for my marriage to be saved and began preparing for my freedom. In the November she asked leave to go up to London for a week to buy lace and ribbon against the season, and it was granted at once because that was a wife's business and cost nothing worth mentioning. She spent the first 2 days buying lace and ribbon so that there would be lace and ribbon. On the third day, she took a hackney to Gray's Inn and asked for Mr. Abel Crowther, whose name she had read 11 times in the small print at the back of her husband's newspapers. Crowther was about 45, thin, untidy, with ink on 3 fingers, and he had the great virtue of a man who has stopped trying to be liked. He heard her out for 20 minutes without once making a sympathetic noise. Then he told her the truth in order, without softening any part of it. There is no divorce for you, Lady Storrington. Not for cruelty. A divorce means a private act of Parliament. It costs upward of £2,000. It wants a trial at common law first, and a suit in the ecclesiastical court after, and a wife has had one against a husband, I believe, 3 times in the history of England. If you simply go, you are a deserting wife. He may sue for restitution of conjugal rights, and he will win, and you will be ordered back into his house. Your daughter is his, entirely. There is no court in this kingdom that can give a child to its mother against a living father. And everything you make with your own 2 hands, from the day you were married until the day one of you dies, is his. The instant it exists, you cannot own it. You cannot bank it. You cannot sue for it. You have at law no more separate existence than his horse. He stopped and looked at her to see how she took it. Verity sat with her gloves in her lap and said, I know all that. I did not come 400 miles to be told what I know. Crowther put down his pen. Then he said the sentence that everything afterwards came out of. The common law is not the only law in England, he said. There is also equity. He drew it for her on a half sheet of paper and made her repeat it back to him twice. The instrument is a deed of separation, he said, and you will notice why the thing is shaped so strangely. So let me tell you before you ask. A wife cannot contract with her own husband. At law, you are one person, and that person is him, and a man cannot make an agreement with himself. So the deed cannot be between the 2 of you. It must be between him on the one part and trustees on the other. And you are not a party to it at all. You are the object of it. Do you understand me? I am the horse, Verity said. Crowther did not smile, but something in his face moved. You are the horse, he said. Now, what we put into the deed. First, he covenants that he will not sue for restitution of conjugal rights, and will not molest you, and will not interfere with your place of residence. That takes his best weapon out of his hand, and he will not notice it going, because he does not think of it as a weapon. Second, all property and earnings coming to you hereafter shall be held by the trustees to your sole and separate use. Those 5 words are the whole of it. In a court of equity, and only there, they make a married woman into somebody who can own a thing. Third, and you must fight for this one, a restraint upon anticipation. It means that even you cannot assign it away or charge it or sign it over. Not to him. Not to anybody. Not if he comes to you in 6 years and puts his hand round your throat and holds a pen out. You will not be able to give it to him, and because you cannot, he cannot take it. Verity looked at the half sheet of paper for a long time. And how much of this will he agree to, she said. Crowther leaned back. That is the whole difficulty, he said. A deed of separation is worth nothing unless the husband signs it of his own free will before witnesses in his right mind, and there is no power on earth that can make him. Not a court, not the Queen. Then what is the price, said Verity. The price, said Crowther, is that you must make the signing of it a thing he wants more than he wants to keep you. She went back to Wiltshire on the mail with a box of ribbon on her knees, and laid it out in her mind the way Ockley laid out a column of figures. He could not touch the land. She had read that in the firelight in November of 1836. He wanted Augusta. She had heard that under an oak tree in the September. I was weighing a house at Chiswick, and she was the only person alive who had understood it. And there was something somewhere with a date on it, and the date was 3 years and 4 months from a night in November when a child had died. And he had looked at a clock. She did not know what that 4th thing was. But she knew what it meant to have found 3 of the 4, and she knew, sitting on the mail with her forehead against the cold glass, exactly what she had to do. She could not beat him. She was never going to beat him. What she could do was make the cheap door look cheaper, and the expensive door look dearer, and then stand well back and let him walk through the one she had left open, believing to the end of his life that he had chosen it himself. From the October of 1837, Verity set about becoming a disappointing wife. The place she was aiming at was narrow. If she defied him, he would break her arm and nothing would change. If she went on being faultless, he would keep her, because a faultless wife in a great house is worth something to a man who is watched. What she wanted was for him to look across the table one evening and feel, without being able to name it, that she was no longer worth the trouble of keeping and not worth the expense of removing. Useless and harmless. She had to stand in that place for 7 months without once stepping out of it. So the venison came up a little overdone. Never burnt. Never sent back. Just dry enough that he put down his knife. She was 4 minutes late into the drawing room when the Ockleys were announced, and 4 minutes late again a fortnight later when the rector came. She forgot the name of a man from the county bench once in front of him in a way that could not be mistaken for anything but stupidity. And when he turned on her afterwards, she did not weep and did not argue and did not go down on her knees. She looked at the carpet and said, in a small, flat voice, "I am sorry, Sir Gervase. I shall do better tomorrow." That answer emptied him out faster than any quarrel ever had. There was nothing in it to take hold of. He could not accuse her of neglect because the house ran and the accounts balanced and the tenants were visited. He could only sit with his anger in his hands and know where to put it. And she watched him learn week by week that she had become tiresome in a way that no violence would cure. Out of doors, she did the opposite. At the assembly at Devizes, she took his arm and kept it. When the rector's wife praised him, she said, "My husband works harder for this county than anybody knows." When a woman admired her gown, she said, "Sir Gervase has always taken very great care of me." By the spring, 3 young men in the district were copying the way he tied his stock. She was building a wall round him out of his own reputation, 1 brick a week, and he could feel it going up and could not say a word against it, because every brick was a compliment. A man inside a wall like that cannot afford a scandal. He can only afford a quiet arrangement. In the February, she went with Mrs. Beale to the Union workhouse at Devizes on the charitable footing that a baronet's wife was expected to keep up. She had never been inside one and had imagined it as a poor sort of hospital. The men were on one side of a wall, and the women on the other, and the children in a third yard, and a woman who came in with a husband and 4 children was separated from all 5 at the door, and might see them for 1 hour on a Sunday if the guardians allowed it. There was a rule of silence in the women's day room, and the floor was very clean. That was the thing Verity could not afterwards get out of her head. It was extremely clean, and nobody in it was allowed to speak. She talked to 3 of them while Mrs. Beale went to find the matron. A widow turned out of a tied cottage 11 days after her husband's funeral. A woman whose husband had gone off to Bristol 2 years before, who could prove neither that he was dead nor that he was living, and so was neither wife nor widow, and could have no relief in her own parish. A girl of 19 who would not say anything at all. All 3 could sew. It was the one thing every poor woman in England could do, and the one thing nobody would pay her a living for. At the door on the way out, an old woman was scrubbing the step, and Mrs. Beale stopped and put her hand on the woman's shoulder and said, "Hannah." They spoke for a minute. Then Mrs. Beale came away with her mouth set and did not offer to explain, and Verity did not ask, and they went out to the gig. That night Verity lay awake and understood coldly and completely that if she walked out of Cadenham with nothing in her hand, the clean, silent room with the rule against speaking was where she would finish. Not a garret, not a cottage, that. Everything that came afterwards came out of that February afternoon. In the January, Crowther had written her a letter with one useful sentence in it. She had asked him whether there was any way for a wife to learn what her husband's affairs really were, and he had answered that there was almost none, with one exception. A will that has been proved is a public record. Any person in England may go to Doctors' Commons, pay the fee, and read the will of any dead man or have a copy made. The fourth baronet had died in 1829. His will had been proved that November. Verity wrote for a copy of it in her own name and paid for it out of the housekeeping by underspending on candles for 2 months. And it came down to her at the end of the February in a sealed packet addressed to Mrs. Marrow, and Mrs. Marrow brought it up to the sewing room and put it on the table and went away and shut the door. It ran to 9 pages. Verity found what she was looking for on the 7th. £40,000 in the 3%. Not settled on the land. Not entailed. The old man had left it to his son absolutely, and then in the flat and pitiless way of a father who has taken the measure of his own child, he had put a condition after it. Absolutely upon the birth of a lawful son of the said Gervase, such son to be born before the 25th day of March 1840. And in default of such son being born before the said day, then over to my nephew Lionel Storrington his heirs and assigns forever. Lady Day, NT40. Verity sat with the paper in front of her and did not move for a long while. November of 1836. A boy and a man standing at the chimney-piece tipping the clock toward the light and saying to himself, 3 years and 4 months. She had spent 5 years trying to understand what she had done. Every beating had had a reason attached to it, and she had believed every one and had lain awake sorting them. Was it the necklace? Was it the soup? And had concluded 100 times over that she was a woman very difficult to live with. And none of it had been about her at all. She was a line in an account. She had been bought in 1832 for £300 a year to produce one thing by one date, and she had failed twice, and the date was now 25 months off. A man does not hate a failing investment. He presses it harder as the term runs down, and when the term is nearly out, he writes it off and looks for another. Verity found that she was not crying. She was reading the sentence again to be sure of the wording and reaching for a pen to copy the reference down. And in that half hour sitting in the sewing room at Cadenham with a copy of a dead man's will in front of her, she understood the thing that governed the whole of the rest of her life. She was not permitted to own anything or sue anybody or swear to anything or speak for herself in any court in England. But nobody had ever thought to forbid her paper. The wills were public. The law reports were public. The registers were public. Any person in England on paying the fee, any person at all. The men who wrote those rules had never once imagined that the person paying the fee might be a wife, and so they had never troubled to shut that door, and it stood open, and it was the only open door in the whole building. The next difficulty was money. She could not sell the jewels. They were not hers, and a jeweler in Bath would have the story into Wiltshire inside a fortnight. Crowther's answer came back within the week. He could not make her lawful. Nothing could until there was a deed. What he could do was build the thing she would need on the day the deed existed. Everything she made would go to Mr. Silas Penhale, a lace factor at Sidmouth, a Devon man of 50, whom Crowther had known for 20 years. Penhale would sell it. Penhale's name would be on the invoice. The money would sit in an account in the joint names of Crowther and Penhale, and if Gervase ever heard of it, it was Penhale's stock and Penhale's money, and let him prove otherwise. It was thin. Crowther said so himself. If it were ever properly tested, it might not hold. But it did one other thing that neither of them thought much about at the time. From the March of 1838 in a ledger at Sidmouth in another man's hand, there began to be a line for every piece she made. Description, weight, price, and a date. A bill with a date on it, Ockley had said, is a witness that never forgets and never contradicts itself. There were 940 of them in the end. In the April over tea in the conservatory, Verity said the thing she had been building toward since the September. She did not lie. That was the point of it, and it was the reason it worked. I have failed him, she said. Augusta reached across the table at once. You must not say so. I do love him, Verity said, and let a silence sit after it. But love is not always enough. He ought to have somebody who understands what he wants. Somebody who can stand up beside a man like that and not be frightened of him. She looked at her friend. I do not think that is me anymore. Augusta said all the right things. She said them for a full minute. And in the middle of the first sentence, something came up behind her eyes and had to be put away again, and Verity saw it go. "He ought to have somebody stronger than I am," Verity said. Augusta looked down at her cup. 11 days later, Gervais sent for his wife to come to the library and told her in the manner of a man laying out a plan he had thought of entirely by himself that he had been considering a formal separation. The negotiation took 3 weeks, and Crowther came down twice and made himself as disagreeable as he knew how. That had been arranged beforehand. I was to fight hard for everything that did not matter, so that Gervais would have the pleasure of beating him, because a man who is winning stops reading. Gervais wanted a great deal. She was to leave Wiltshire and never return. She was to have no communication with Clemency except such as he permitted, and he was under no obligation to permit any. She was never to use the name Storrington in trade. She was to bring no suit and speak to no newspaper. Verity gave him all of it slowly and with difficulty, and twice she wept, and once she asked for a night to think, and every one of those was arranged too. She fought over 3 lines only. She fought over them for 2 hours on the last afternoon, until her voice went and Gervais sat back in his chair with his fingers laid together and enjoyed himself thoroughly, and finally waved his hand and told Crowther to let her have her 3 lines and let us be done with this. The first was that he covenanted not to sue for restitution of conjugal rights. The second was that all property and earnings coming to her thereafter should be held by the trustees to her sole and separate use. The third was a restraint upon anticipation. He signed on the 12th day of May, 1838, in the library at Cadenham, before 2 witnesses in 2 parts, 1 for each trustee. I was in an excellent humor all evening. He believed he had bought his freedom for 3 lines of lawyer's rubbish, and Verity, who had made certain he would believe it, went upstairs and was quietly sick. The rent dinner was held on the 25th of May every year, and had been since his grandfather's time. 40 at table, all the tenants, the 2 magistrates from the bench, the rector, 3 neighboring families, old Lady Wrenbury, who came to everything, and the Pelhams, father and daughter. It went on well for an hour. Then a footman knew that Spring filled the wrong glass at the wrong hand, and Gervais put down his fork and stood up. The room went quiet in stages, the way a room does. Verity, who had been waiting 13 days for something of this kind, put both hands flat in her lap under the cloth. "I have borne with incompetence in this house long enough," he said. 40 faces turned. "She cannot manage servants. She cannot manage this estate. She cannot open her mouth in company without shaming me." He let that sit. "And after 6 years, she has not given this family an heir." Somebody's chair scraped. Nobody spoke. "From this day," said Gervais, "she is no longer my wife." Verity got up out of her chair and went down on her knees on the boards in front of 40 people. She wept. She reached for his hand, and he took it away. She said, "Please, I will do better. I will be the wife you deserve. Do not put me out." And she said it in the wrecked voice of a woman who has nothing left and no dignity to spend. And 3 of the women at that table were crying before she had finished, and old Lord Wrenbury said out loud to nobody that it was the cruelest thing he had seen in 50 years. She was not acting the grief. She had 6 years of it standing ready, and she simply opened the door and let it out. What she was acting was the surprise. The deed was 13 days old and lying in Crowther's strong box at Gray's Inn, and every single thing that man was doing to her in front of 40 witnesses was already bought and paid for. She knelt on those boards for 3 reasons and had settled all 3 in advance. The first was that if she had stood up straight and taken it calmly, he would have known within the hour that something was wrong, and there were still ways he might have gone at the deed sideways. The second was witnesses, not servants who can be dismissed and disbelieved. Magistrates, a dowager countess, a rector, 40 people of standing who would remember for the rest of their lives that Sir Gervais Storrington put his wife out of doors himself in public, and that she went unwillingly. The third was the one she had not told even Crowther. One day she thought, kneeling with her face wet and her hands out, "One day this man is going to need it to be true that he thought I was dead. And every soul in this room is going to remember what he said tonight." They packed a trunk for her while the guests stood about in the hall, not knowing where to look. She was allowed her clothes, her mother's lace pillow, and the square of embroidered flannel out of the drawer in the nursery. She did not ask for anything else, and nobody offered. Augusta was waiting at the foot of the stairs in an emerald gown Verity had never seen, with diamonds at her throat. She had the face of a woman trying very hard to look sorry. "I have everything now," she said. Verity stopped in front of her. She was near enough to it in that half-minute that she could feel the shape of the words in her mouth. "He will begin within a month. He does not need a reason. There is a house at Chiswick, Augusta, and if he speaks of it to you, run." She had 1/2 minute and one friend, and she spent it thinking about a marble staircase and a nursery at the top of it, and a child of 4 who was asleep on the other side of the ceiling. If she warned Augusta, Augusta would refuse him. If Augusta refused him, there was no wedding and no new wife, and no reason on God's earth for Gervais Storrington to leave his lawful wife alive and at liberty in London, where she could be found. She took Augusta's hands and she smiled and she said 6 words. "Take good care of him, Augusta." Augusta laughed. She thought it was defeat. Verity walked out through the front door of Cadenham Hall and did not look back at it, and she carried that half-minute for the rest of her life, and no court ever tried her for it, and she never once claimed she had been right. She reached Branscombe 2 days later. Her mother opened the door, saw the trunk, and went white. Her father came out of the study and said, "Before anything else, what have you done to lose us the annuity?" Charlotte Dunstan sat down and cried and told her daughter to go back and fall at his feet and beg him. Edmund, 26 now, and in his 2nd year of orders, stood in the doorway and could not look at her, and went out to the church at some point in the evening and did not come back until she had gone up. Nobody asked whether she had eaten. Nobody asked where she was going to sleep. Nobody asked whether she was safe. She slept on the wooden bench under the porch wrapped in her cloak, because she could not make herself go up to the room she had slept in as a girl. Sophia came out at about 11 with a candle. She was 17. She sat down on the end of the bench and did not say she was sorry, which Verity was grateful for. Then she said, "Will you teach me the lace?" Verity said, "If I ever have a house come to it." Sophia said, "I will," and went in. Before daylight, Verity picked up the trunk and walked out of the gate, and did not knock and did not say goodbye. And she never slept another night under that roof. On the mail to London, she read her copy of the deed, through twice. Crowther had been right about all of it. She had bought her body back for 3 lines that a clever man had thought were nothing, and there was not a thing Gervais Storrington could now do to her person or her purse from one end of England to the other. Then she came to the clause about the child. "Such access as the said Sir Gervais shall in his absolute discretion permit." Verity folded the paper and put it inside her stays, and did the sum she had been refusing to do since the 12th of May. She had bought herself. She had not bought her daughter. And there was no clause on earth that could have, because there was no law in England under which a mother had any right to a child whose father was alive and objected. She was 28 years old. She had 11 pounds and a lace pillow, and Clemency was not yet 5, and asleep at the top of a marble staircase 80 miles behind her. The room over the baker's in Cranbourne Alley cost 4 shillings a week, and the roof leaked in 3 places. Verity set 2 basins and a pail before she lay down on wet nights and learned to sleep through the sound. She worked from first light until the light went, and then by one lamp until she could not see. Her fingers swelled and the pins went in under the nails. Twice she bled onto the work and washed it and wound a rag round the finger and went on. The first thing she finished was a collar. Penhale sold it in Sidmouth for 11 shillings and sent up the account with the date on it. Then the Queen was crowned, and on the 28th of June, 1838, London filled with every soul in England who could get to it. Mrs. Marrow had come up from Wiltshire by then, and the 2 of them worked 40 hours without sleeping and sold every scrap of it in 3 days. That was the capital. £9 and some silver made out of other people's excitement. By the Christmas, there were 6 women in 2 rooms off Long Acre, and 3 of them had come out of the workhouse at Devizes. Sophia arrived in the November with a bundle and no money, having walked out of the parsonage the way her sister had. In the spring of 1839, they took a house in Conduit Street. Lady Wrenbury came in the first month, looked at a piece for a long moment and said, "I told you to remember that I said so." She sent 4 women that season, and those 4 sent 11 more. But the lease was taken in the name of Abel Crowther of Gray's Inn. The bank account was Crowther and Penhale. Every order for every gown was entered in a book belonging to two men who between them could not have made a yard of lace to save their lives. Verity ran all of it and signed none of it. She acted in the language of the deed as agent for the trustees, and on the invoices she stamped a name that belonged to neither of the households that had owned her. V. Dunstan. Gervais Storrington came after her 3 times. In the September of 1838 he sued in the ecclesiastical court for restitution of conjugal rights, praying that his wife be admonished to return to cohabitation. Crowther went into chancery for an injunction on the ground that the husband had covenanted under seal not to bring it. The covenant was produced. It held. It took 8 months and cost her nearly everything she had made. In the June 2 men came to Conduit Street and declared that all the stock on the premises was the property of Sir Gervais Storrington, a married woman being incapable of ownership at law. Crowther was there within the hour with the deed. Sole and separate use. Restraint upon anticipation. The stock was held by trustees and could not be assigned by her to him or to anybody, and therefore could not be reached. The men went away. He had spent 2 hours on a May afternoon giving away 3 lines to shut his wife up, and the 3 lines had turned out to be the wall. The third thing he did was the one that worked. He refused every application to see the child briefly by return for 2 years. In the October of 1838, Verity took the coach down and stood at the park railing on the Devizes Road, because Mrs. Beale had got word to her that the nurse walked out that way at 3. They came along the far side a little after 4. Clemency was 5 that autumn and was in a blue coat. She looked across the grass at the woman at the railing, straight, with no doubt in it at all. Then she turned her face away and took the nurse's hand and walked on. It had not occurred to Verity that a child of 5 remembers everything, and that a child who has been told for 5 months that her mother left her will believe it, since there is nobody in the house to tell her otherwise. She did not go back to the railing. In the summer of 1839, Penhale took her into Devon, where the lace villages had been dying since the machines came into Nottingham. In Beer and Branscombe, there were women of 60 who had worked at the pillow since they were 6 and were getting 4pence for a day, and not getting that every day. Verity had Crowther draw a contract in the trustees' names to take everything that 40 of them could make at a rate fixed for 2 years, whether it sold or not. She stood at Penhale's shoulder while he signed it. The newspaper came up to Conduit Street in the 2nd week of the November of 1839 without a covering letter. There was 1 line in pencil across the top margin in a hand Verity knew. "You had better read page 4. Halfway down the 2nd column, between a sale of shorthorns and the appointment of a coroner's deputy, was a notice of 8 lines. Married on the 17th ultimo at the parish church of Marlcombe, Sir Gervais Storrington Bart, of Cadenham Hall in this county, to Augusta, only daughter of Hector Pelham, Esquire, of Marlcombe." Verity read it 3 times. Then she put the paper down on the cutting table and stood with both hands flat on either side of it. She was alive. She was standing in a room in Conduit Street with 22 women working behind her. There had been no divorce and no Act of Parliament, and she, of all women in England, knew how impossible either was, because she had spent 2 years learning it. Which meant that on the 17th of October, 1839, in a parish church in Wiltshire, in front of witnesses, her husband had committed a felony. Crowther had it out within a fortnight. To get a license, a man swears an affidavit, and Gervais Storrington had sworn that his first wife died of a fever at Boulogne in the February of 1839, and had produced a foreign certificate got through an agent in that town for under £12. Hector Pelham had heard the talk, and that was never afterwards disputed. He was mortgaged to the roof and had a daughter of 26 on his hands, and had decided deliberately not to ask the one question that would have spoiled it. Then Crowther told her the rest, and it was the cruelest thing anybody said to her in 8 years. "You cannot be a witness," he said. "A wife is not competent to give evidence against her own husband, in this or in anything. You may sit in the room. You may not open your mouth. The law stopped your mouth on the day you married him, and will not open it again while he lives." Verity said then, "Who in England can prove it?" And Crowther, who in 3 years had never told her anything that was not exactly true, said the thing that turned the whole of the last year. He said. The second one. Because that marriage is void. She was never his wife at all, and a woman who is not a wife is a competent witness against the man. The felony that has ruined her is the very thing that gives her a voice. Verity did 3 things in 4 days. She paid Cuthbert Snell for a certified copy of the marriage entry of the 17th of October, 1839. She paid the incumbent at Marlcombe for a certified copy of the parish register of the 11th of July, 1832. And she went to Sidmouth and sat with Penhale over the ledgers for 1839 and took out every invoice and receipt and postmarked letter that showed where Verity Storrington had been in each of the 12 months, and most particularly in the February when she was supposed to have died at Boulogne and had in fact been in Long Acre with a fever of her own and a doctor's bill to prove it. 940 invoices, every one with a date on it. Then she wrote to Augusta. The uniform penny post began on the 10th of January, 1840. Under the old system, a letter was paid for by the person who received it and could be refused at the door and sent back. Under the new one, the sender paid, and the letter went to the house. Whatever anybody thought about it, which meant that a letter to Cadenham could no longer be quietly refused. It could only be taken out of somebody's hand. She wrote on the 11th of January. Nothing came back. She wrote again on the 3rd of February. Nothing came back. On the 10th of February, the Queen was married, and the country learned that the lace on the dress had been made in Devon on purpose to save the trade there. Honiton was a mania inside a week, and there were perhaps 4 houses in London that could supply the fine work, and one of them held a contract for everything that 40 Devon women could produce. Damaris Penhale wrote from Beer that there was not a woman there without work for the first time in 20 years. Verity's name was not printed anywhere. She stood in the doorway of her own workroom with the noise of 30 women behind her and thought about a child in a blue coat whom she had not held in 20 months. Augusta came at the end of the February in a plain cloak with the hood up. The girl at the counter did not know her and asked her business, and she said she had come to see the owner and could not say the name, and stood there until Verity came out. Everything Verity ever learned about what had happened at Cadenham, she learned in the fitting room in the next hour out of Augusta's own mouth. The first blow had come in the 3rd week, and there had been no reason at all. She had asked whether he wanted tea. By the 2nd month she had begun with the powder. By the 4th she had gone over to high collars and long sleeves, and had told the same 2 lies about a door and a staircase so often that she heard other women repeating them back to her. "Why did you not stop me?" Augusta said. Verity said, "Would you have believed me?" Augusta sat with that. She was 26 and she looked 40. "No," she said. Then Verity told her the other thing because she had promised herself she would tell all of it in the first hour and let Augusta decide what to do with it. "You are not his wife. I was alive on the 17th of October, and I am alive now, and there was never any divorce. That marriage was void from the first minute of it. In law, you have never been married at all." Augusta did not cry at that. She put her hand over her mouth and sat quite still, and then she said, in an ordinary voice, "Then there is nothing holding me." "I wrote to you in January," Verity said, "and again in February." "I never had a letter," said Augusta. They looked at one another. "You did not take my husband," Verity said. "You took the prison I walked out of. And I have not hated you for a single day since the 25th of May, 1838. Augusta went back to Wiltshire that night to fetch her papers and her mother's rings, and to be out of the house before the week was up. Word came on the 4th of March from Mrs. Beale. There had been a fall on the great staircase. Mr. Craddock had been 3 hours in the room and had come out and said what such men say when they have decided to say it plainly. A fracture at the base of the skull and bleeding within and nothing to be done, and 4 days at the outside. Verity came through the gates of Cadenham for the first time in 21 months that evening. She went up alone and took no paper and no pen and sent for nobody. Augusta lay flat on her back, with her head packed round with sandbags and the curtains drawn to a hand's width, and she knew Verity at once. They talked a long time about nothing, about the school at Bath, about a dog Augusta had owned when she was 9. Then Augusta said, "Will it be any use what I say?" And Verity, who had been sitting there 2 hours, deciding whether she was going to be the kind of woman who asks a dying friend for evidence, told her the whole truth, including the parts she was ashamed of. She said that anything Augusta told her now was worth nothing in a court, and would be shut out as hearsay with one exception in the whole law of England. If a person about to die makes a statement about how they came by their death at a time when they know for a certainty that they are dying, it may be read to a jury as though they were standing there. It had to be about the injury and nothing else. Not the marriage, not the 8 years, only the staircase. And she herself could never give evidence about anything because she was his wife. If you would rather not, she said, I will not ask again, and I will stay to the end either way. Augusta looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she said, fetch them in. Verity sent for the rector and for Mr. Boyce, the magistrate from Devizes, and for Cuthbert Snell, who kept the register for the district and could write a fair hand and had a seal. They came in at 9 in the evening and stood where Augusta could see them, and Verity asked the question the law required in the words the law required, and her voice did not go. Do you know of a certainty that you are dying? Yes, said Augusta. And she told them what had happened at the head of the stairs, that she had been carrying a box down, that he had come out of the study with a letter in his hand torn open and asked where she had been in London, that she had said she was leaving, that he had put himself in the doorway, and she had tried to go past him, and he had taken her arm, and she had pulled away, and he had pushed her with both hands in the chest. Snell wrote it. The magistrate signed it. The rector signed it. Snell sealed it and put the date on it. Then they went out and the door was shut, and what Augusta said after that was not written down anywhere. She said, can you forgive me? Verity said, I forgave you the day I walked out of this house. Augusta Pelham died a little before 6 on the morning of the 8th of March, 1840. On the morning after the death, Verity wrote a short letter to the master of the Union workhouse at Devizes about a woman named Hannah and enclosed the coach fare and told nobody in the world that she had done it. The inquest was held at the Storrington Arms on the 12th of March before Mr. Jabez Winnard, coroner for the county, and 15 jurymen who were farmers, and a wheelwright and the blacksmith. The body lay in the room behind as the law required, and the jury had viewed it. The first thing that happened was that Winnard had to settle how the deceased should be described in his book. He had the 2 certificates in front of him. He wrote, and then he read out what he had written. Augusta Pelham, spinster of Marlcombe in this county, aged 26 years. At the back of the room, Hector Pelham stood halfway up out of his chair and then sat down again and did not speak once during the whole of that day or the next. Winnard then said that he understood Lady Storrington was present, and that although a wife was not a competent witness in a court of law, he was not a court of law, and if she wished to be sworn, he would hear her. Crowther leaned across and said one sentence into her ear. If you speak today, they will build his whole defense out of it at the assizes, and every word will be struck out and the verdict with it. Verity Storrington sat down in the last row, folded her hands, and did not open her mouth for 2 days. It was the hardest thing she ever did, and it was also the last piece of the arrangement. She had built the other 6 over 4 months precisely so that this one would not be wanted. Mr. Craddock was called first and paid his guinea under the Act, and produced the results of the examination he had made after death. Asked whether the injuries were consistent with a fall, he said they were. Asked whether they were consistent with a fall that was not assisted, he said in the same flat voice that in his judgment they were not, and gave his reasons, and the reasons took 11 minutes, and nobody in the room understood half of them, and nobody doubted a word. Jem Frost was called second. He was 13 and had to be told twice to speak up. He said that in the January and again in the February, a letter had come for the mistress, and that Sir Gervase had taken both out of his hand in the stable yard and told him to say nothing. I was asked how he could be certain of the dates, and Jem Frost said that everybody in the village knew the dates because that was the winter. The letters went for a penny, and you could send one anywhere in England. And his mother had sent one to his aunt in Taunton for the first time in her life, and there was talk of nothing else for a month. Mrs. Prudence Beale was called third. She had been 31 years in that house. She gave her evidence for 1 hour and 10 minutes, and she began in 1832, and she left nothing out, and by the middle of it, 2 of the jury were not looking up. She knew before she began that a servant who gives such evidence against the family does not get her pension. She gave it anyway. Nobody in that room ever knew that a woman named Hannah had been taken off the books at Devizes 3 days earlier and put to plain sewing in Conduit Street at 7 shillings a week. Mrs. Beale went to her grave believing it had been the parish. Mr. Cuthbert Snell was called forth and produced 2 documents, and that was the whole of his evidence. A certified copy of a marriage solemnized at Marlcombe on the 11th of July, 1832, between Gervase Storrington and Verity Dunstan. A certified copy of a marriage solemnized at Marlcombe on the 17th of October, 1839, between Gervase Storrington and Augusta Pelham, both under seal. Both evidence in any court in England without a living soul to swear to them. He put them on the table and stood down, and the paper did the whole of it, and the woman in the back row never had to say one word. Mr. Crowther and Mr. Penhill were called fifth and produced the deed of separation of the 12th of May, 1838, and then the invoices, 940 of them tied with tape, month by month through 1839. The February bundle was read out in full. A doctor's bill from Longacre, a carrier's receipt from Sidmouth, a milliner's order dated the day after the day Sir Gervase Storrington had sworn on oath that his wife lay dead at Boulogne. The last thing put before the jury was Augusta's statement, and Wynard read it himself in a level voice from beginning to end. That was the first and only time anybody described what had happened at the head of the stairs, and it was described by the woman it had happened to 4 days after she died. Sir Gervase Storrington rose and objected that his wife could not be permitted to give evidence against him. Mr. Wynard looked at him over his spectacles and said, "Lady Storrington has not spoken." The jury were out 20 minutes and came back with a verdict of willful murder, and he was committed to Salisbury to await the assizes. At the summer assizes, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter and not of murder, and he was sentenced to transportation for the term of his natural life. He was then arraigned under the Act of 1828 for feloniously marrying Augusta Pelham while his first wife was living, and to that there was no defense at all. 7 years to run after the first. The years meant nothing to anybody, but the conviction stated on the record that the marriage of the 17th of October 1839 had never existed. Lady Day fell on the 25th of March 1840, and Gervase Storrington passed it in the Gaol at Salisbury. There was no lawful son. £40,000 in the 3% went over that morning to Lionel Storrington of Bath, exactly as his uncle had directed in 1829. Lionel wrote a stiff and decent letter offering Verity whatever she thought right. She thanked him and asked for nothing. Cadenham went to nobody. He was tenant for life and still alive 8,000 miles away, and Chancery put in a receiver and the house was shut and the furniture sheeted and the Beech Avenue went on growing. "You may have their money," Crowther said, "or you may have quiet. You cannot have both." Verity did not take the shilling. The petition went into Chancery in the July of 1840 under an act that had received the royal assent in the August of 1839 and had been fought for by other women in other rooms whom Verity Storrington never met. It allowed the court for the first time in the history of England to give the custody of a child under 7 to its mother, provided the mother had not been found guilty of adultery. Clemency had been born in the September of 1833. In the July of 1840, she was 6 years and 10 months old. There were 2 months in it. Gervase had bound her by that deed against a great many things in 1838. Crowther put his finger on the clause and said the truest sentence anybody said in the whole 8 years. He could not covenant against an act that did not exist. And then there was the other half of it. For 26 months, Verity had lived in a way that could not be attacked. No admirer, no evening that could not be accounted for. No supper with any man that Mrs. Marrow had not sat through. Crowther had told her to live so in the first week, and she had done it because he told her to, and had assumed it was to protect the business. It was not. It had been for this from the beginning, against a law that did not yet exist. And the moment the other side had nothing to allege, the petition went through. She fetched clemency from the gates of Cadenham on a morning in the August of 1840. The child came down the steps holding the nurse's hand and stopped 6 feet away and looked at her mother. She was nearly 7. She remembered all of it, and she had been given a version of it for 26 months, and she was angry in the way that only a child of that age can be angry, which is completely and without any hope of being argued out of it. Verity did not explain, and did not apologize, and did not put out her arms. She knelt down on the gravel and opened the trunk and took out her mother's lace pillow and set it on her knees and turned it so the child could see the pins. "Would you like to learn to count the bobbins?" she said. 4 and cross, 4 and cross. They came to Conduit Street in the autumn. Her father knelt on the boards of the workroom in front of 30 women and asked forgiveness in a speech that was from beginning to end a sermon. He spoke of the workings of providence and of a father's fallibility and of the duty of children. He did not at any point say the words 300 pounds. Her mother made no speech. Charlotte Dunstan stood in the doorway and said, "I knew. I always knew. I was afraid of him, and I was afraid of being poor, and I let you go back 9 times. That was worth more than everything her father said, and Verity told her so. Edmund asked for nothing. He had been ordained in 1838, had refused the Wiltshire living that Cadenham money had kept warm for him since he was 19, and had taken a curacy at £80 a year, east of the Tower. He had not come to be forgiven. He had come to say that he understood what he had done in his sister's kitchen in the November of 1836, and that he would not come again unless he was sent for. Sophia had been in the workroom 2 years, and did not need to come to the door at all. Verity heard them out. Then she said she had forgiven every one of them long ago, and she watched the relief come into her father's face. And then she finished the sentence. "But forgiveness does not give back trust. I wish you well, and I wish you health, and if any of you is ever hungry, write to me, and you will not be hungry. But I will not come back to what we were, because my life mended when I walked away from it, and I am not going to open something that is healed." There was no quarrel and no scene. Her mother cried at the door, and Verity let her. She kept Edmund for tea. She kept Sophia. She saw her father and mother into the street and shut the door. There were 31 women working in Conduit Street at the end of that year. 11 had come out of a workhouse. 7 had left husbands. 1 was a woman named Hannah, who had a sister in Wiltshire and who never found out why the letter had come. Sophia taught Clemency to wind the bobbins, and Clemency, who did not forgive her mother for another 2 years, and then did it all at once, and without discussion sat on a stool by the window to catch the light the way girls in Devon had done for 200 years. Verity was 30 years old. She thought sometimes about the 4 pieces of paper that had done it. A deed made between a man and 2 trustees, in which she was not even a party. 2 certified copies out of a register that a proud young official had shown her in a schoolroom in 1837 because there was nobody else to show it to. And 1 statement written at 9 at night by that same official at the bedside of a woman who had 4 days left and spent 1 of them on her. Not 1 of the 4 had her name on it as a person who could act. That was what the law of England allowed her, and she took it, and it was enough, because she was not free and would not be. She was the lawful wife of a convict on the other side of the world, and while he lived, she could not marry and could not be widowed and could be nothing on paper but Lady Storrington. She had believed in the bad years that surviving would be enough. She understood by now that it never had been the point. The greatest revenge was not the ruin of the man who had ruined her. It was refusing to let him be the one who decided what she became, and that was the single thing out of everything she had lost and everything she had built that no law and no man and no court in England could ever take back off her.